Christmas has always been my favorite day, the one time of year I could count on seeing my son. But when I arrived at his home with a small gift and a warm heart, the woman he married stepped into the doorway and told me there was no place for me. She placed a plastic plate on the floor with scraps and told me to eat there like an animal. I didn't cry. I simply smiled because I already knew what she had forgotten: loyalty leaves footprints. And hers were all over the photos I'd saved, the ones of her and her boss, very cozy during all those late nights at work. My name is Lillian Crane, and I am 71 years old. I spent the morning wrapping a small gift for my son, humming to myself the way I always do when Christmas memories drift back. The bus ride to his house felt longer than usual, but my heart stayed light. I pictured warm food, laughter, maybe even a hug at the door. When the house finally came into view, glowing with lights and wreaths, I paused for a moment on the walkway, smoothing my coat. After all these years, I still wanted to look like the kind of mother someone would proudly welcome inside. I rang the bell with a hopeful smile, completely unaware of the humiliation waiting on the other side. The door opened halfway, but instead of seeing my son, I was met with her, arms folded, eyes already impatient. She didn't invite me in. She didn't even step aside. She simply said there wasn't room this year, as if I were an extra chair taking up space instead of family. The sound of laughter floated from somewhere deeper in the house, reminding me that celebration was happening, just not for me. I tried to peek past her shoulder, longing for a glimpse of the boy I raised, but she shifted deliberately, blocking the view. In that instant, the warmth I'd carried with me from home felt like it had been left out in the snow. I asked gently if I could at least wish everyone a Merry Christmas. She sighed loudly, like kindness was an inconvenience, and stepped outside, closing the door behind her. The cold nipped at my cheeks while she lectured me about boundaries and new traditions, as if motherhood expired at a certain age. Her voice grew sharper with each sentence, cutting away whatever dignity I had left. She wasn't trying to talk, she was trying to push me out of a life I had helped build. I realized then that I hadn't been invited. I had simply arrived where I was no longer wanted. She disappeared inside for a moment and returned holding a flimsy plastic plate piled with scraps, half-eaten vegetables, a crust of bread, bits no one wanted. Without shame, she placed it on the doormat and gestured down, suggesting I eat like a dog. The cold air seemed to freeze time around us. For a heartbeat, I simply stared at the plate, then at the woman who thought this was acceptable. I expected anger or tears to rise, but instead, something steadier filled my chest: clarity. Cruelty, when shown so openly, is strangely liberating. It leaves no room for doubt about the hearts it lives in. She waited for me to break, to beg, to argue, to prove her importance by fighting for a place at a table she had already decided I didn't deserve. Instead, I straightened my shoulders and let a small smile form. Sometimes calm is the loudest response a person can offer. I told her gently that dogs are loyal, a quality she clearly didn't value. The words weren't shouted, they were simply true. Her face flushed, but she said nothing. For the first time that evening, the power shifted, not because I lashed out, but because I refused to be humiliated. I realized then that staying, even outside that doorway, meant accepting the role she had written for me. So I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't step inside a house where respect was unwelcome. I wouldn't beg for kindness from someone determined to withhold it. Without another word, I placed the small wrapped gift gently on a chair by the porch, knowing it might never reach the hands it was meant for. My heart ached, but my dignity stood firm. Sometimes walking away is the only way to remain whole. As I turned and walked down the icy path, snow began to fall in soft, drifting flakes. Behind me, the door shut, sealing in warmth that no longer belonged to me. Ahead of me stretched a quiet street and a cold evening, but also peace. I didn't rush, I didn't look back. Each step carried me further from cruelty and closer to clarity. What she didn't know, what she never thought to ask, was that loyalty leaves evidence, and I had more than memories tucked safely away. Tomorrow would not arrive empty-handed. She reached home, set down her coat, and opened the quiet folder that had been waiting for weeks. Screenshots, messages, and dates, all carefully organized. She hadn't gone looking for trouble. Trouble had arrived in the form of late nights at work and whispered phone calls ending abruptly when footsteps neared. So she had documented, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Tonight's humiliation didn't break her. It confirmed what the evidence already proved. Loyalty wasn't missing by accident. It had been replaced. She closed the folder gently, grateful she had trusted her instincts before anyone else tried to rewrite the truth. She remembered every uneasy evening when the house lights across town stayed dark long past midnight. Her daughter-in-law always had an excuse: deadlines, meetings, unexpected crises. Yet the excuses sounded thinner each time, like fabric stretched to tearing point. Her son, busy and trusting, never questioned much. That was what hurt most, not just betrayal toward her, but toward him. She had hoped the phase would pass. Instead, the distance between truth and lies had quietly grown wider. until tonight it finally snapped. Standing by the window, watching snow fall under the street lamp, she promised herself that silence would no longer be part of the problem. The next morning, with steady hands, she scrolled through the images again, dinners for two, hands intertwined, stolen moments captured by a camera that never judged. Dates and times lined up neatly beside them, matching every late shift story word for word. She didn't add captions or commentary. Truth didn't need decoration. She simply selected the clearest photos and sent them to her son, along with a short message. Please come see me when you can. We need to talk. Then she put the phone down and made tea, knowing the truth had finally left the shadows where it had been hiding far too long. When he arrived, confusion clouded his face, concern first, then shock as she handed him the phone. He scrolled slowly, denial flickering like a candle struggling against wind. Then the flame went out. Silence filled the room, heavy and aching. She didn't accuse me. She didn't dramatize. She simply explained what had happened at Christmas and how long she had suspected something was wrong. Pain replaced confusion in his eyes, not at her, but at the realization he had been living beside a lie. He thanked her quietly, voice breaking, and asked for time to breathe. She nodded, wishing she could take the hurt away, yet knowing the truth, though painful, was necessary. Within hours, the facade collapsed. Calls were made, questions asked, stories unraveled. The woman who had once spoken so confidently at the door now struggled to keep calm as her explanations contradicted each other. Her carefully woven image began to fray, thread by thread, until even she could no longer pretend it was intact. The difference now was simple. There was evidence, undeniable, time-stamped, real. Her son didn't shout. He didn't insult me. He simply faced the reality that had been carefully hidden beneath holiday lights and polite smiles. And reality, once seen, refused to be unseen. As more details surfaced, it became clear that the betrayal wasn't only emotional. Boundaries had been crossed financially too, shared accounts dipped into without permission, business expenses that never reached the office, small withdrawals that added up over time. It wasn't a single mistake. It was a pattern. Watching her son process each revelation felt like witnessing a glass heart crack slowly along invisible seams. She stayed beside him, supportive, calm, refusing to fuel anger yet refusing to soften the truth. Love, she knew, sometimes means standing firm when lies beg to be forgiven too quickly. Eventually, the last thread snapped. Words like trust, loyalty, and marriage could no longer be stretched to cover what had happened. Her son sat quietly, staring at the floor, while the woman who had once mocked his mother struggled to justify the unjustifiable. For the first time, he truly saw the disrespect, not just toward himself, but toward the family he came from. And in that moment, the Christmas incident stopped being a misunderstanding and became a symbol of something far deeper. Trust, once shattered, does not fade softly, it echoes. And they were all hearing it now. Her son called the next day, voice steady but tired. He asked if she would go with him to speak to a lawyer, not for revenge, but for clarity. She agreed, sitting beside him in a quiet office where the walls held more secrets than the people inside ever revealed. The lawyer explained rights, shared assets, proof, and how deception changes everything in the eyes of the law. It wasn't dramatic, it was factual. Each sentence helped her son stand a little straighter. She didn't push him toward any decision. She simply held his hand the way she had when he was a child, reminding him that he wasn't alone in the storm. Bank statements were reviewed with calm precision. Transactions appeared that could no longer hide behind excuses, hotel stays, luxury dinners, funds shifted without consent. Numbers don't lie. They simply sit quietly until someone is brave enough to read them. Her son's silence grew heavier as the truth took shape. She watched his heart break carefully, like a priceless vase tipping toward the edge. She wanted to catch it, to protect him from the impact, but some things must break before healing can begin. At least now, the damage had a boundary. At least now they could see where trust had ended. The family doesn't stay silent for long. Soon, questions began to ripple outward, concerned calls, shocked messages, relatives who had sensed something but never knew what to say. She didn't gossip. She simply confirmed what was already unfolding. The woman who once dismissed her so easily now found herself answering to a much larger audience. Respect, once taken for granted, slipped through her fingers like water. And though she never wished humiliation on anyone, there was a certain justice in watching truth finally demand its due, not loudly, not cruelly, but firmly. Inside the house that had once shut her out, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations sharpened. Dinners turned quiet. The distance between husband and wife widened into something impossible to ignore. Promises were demanded, explanations unraveled, and every word now carried the weight of suspicion. She kept her distance physically, but emotionally she stayed close to her son, offering meals, tea, and a listening ear. She never once said, "I told you so." Pain doesn't need reminders, it just needs space to breathe. Eventually, the truth surfaced not in one dramatic outburst but in pieces. A shaky apology here, a reluctant admission there. The story she had woven so confidently began collapsing under the pressure of facts. She tried to redirect blame, to soften the reality she had shaped with her own choices, but the damage was already done. Confession didn't erase what had happened, it simply confirmed it. Her son listened, quiet and pale, realizing love had been shared unevenly, loyalty from one side, convenience from the other. Once honesty entered the home, nothing looked the same. Friends stepped back. Some relatives chose sides. Holidays were canceled, plans postponed, smiles replaced with caution. She moved gently through the chaos, refusing to add fuel to the fire. Her role wasn't to punish, it was to stand as proof that respect matters. The same door that once closed in her face now opened often, not out of obligation but out of gratitude. Her son needed a steady place to land, and she became it. There came a day when denial finally ran out of places to hide. Papers were filed, living arrangements discussed, futures reconsidered. No one celebrated, not even her. But beneath the sadness lived a quiet strength. Her son wasn't walking away from love. He was walking toward self-respect. And she, who had once been told there was no place for her, now realized she had always belonged, not because of what others decided, but because of who she chose to be. Dignity, she learned, is the one gift that cannot be taken, only surrendered. And she refused to surrender it ever again. The final conversation didn't happen in anger. It happened at the kitchen table, where so many ordinary meals had once been shared. She sat quietly beside her son as he asked clear, direct questions. No shouting, no drama, just the truth standing in the middle of the room, impossible to step around anymore. The woman who once mocked her mother-in-law now looked smaller, stripped of the confidence cruelty had once given her. Every excuse sounded weaker than the last. Eventually, words simply ran out. There was nothing left to defend because the truth had already spoken for itself. The moment came when her son had to choose what to protect, the illusion he'd been living in, or the truth that now lay shattered across the table. He didn't rush. He sat in silence, hands folded, breathing through the pain like someone learning to live with a new scar. She watched him, heart aching, knowing she couldn't make the decision for him. Loyalty had always been his instinct. But now loyalty demanded honesty, not blindness. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. He chose truth, not because it was easy, but because it was the only thing left that could still be trusted. Slowly, he began to see the pattern, the dismissiveness, the mockery, the way his mother had been pushed aside piece by piece. Her Christmas humiliation wasn't a single act of cruelty. It was a window into a much larger problem. The realization broke him in a different way. Apologized, not because he had wronged her intentionally, but because he had allowed someone else's disrespect to go unanswered. She placed a hand on his shoulder, reminding him gently that forgiveness isn't weakness. It is simply choosing not to let bitterness become permanent. There were tears, real ones. Not dramatic, loud sobs, but quiet tears that carried years of unsaid things. Apologies came too, some sincere, some spoken more from fear than remorse. She accepted only what was true. Not every sorry needs to be taken in. Some simply need to be heard and left where they fall. Her son wept most for the time he couldn't get back, moments when he had believed everything was fine, while the ground beneath his life was quietly shifting. She held him close, the way she once had when childhood disappointments felt like the end of the world. Clear boundaries followed, not as punishment, but as protection. Her son insisted on honesty going forward, transparency in finances, respect where it had been missing for far too long. She supported him quietly from a distance, never interfering, always available. She also created her own boundaries. She would no longer enter any space where kindness was optional. Her worth was not a debate topic, and her presence would never again be something granted or denied by anyone else. It felt strange at first, powerful, peaceful, and necessary. Eventually, the truth stopped being private. Friends noticed changes. The family whispered less and spoke more plainly. Not everyone approved of the decisions being made, but she had finally learned that public opinion is the smallest measure of a life. What mattered was that respect had been restored. She no longer felt like a shadow lurking at the edge of family gatherings. She stood in the light, calm, steady, unashamed. Christmas would never be the same again, but maybe that was a blessing in disguise. Just when she thought the story was finally ending, life opened a new chapter. Stay with me. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. There came a final day, quiet, almost ordinary, when the chapter simply closed. No more arguments, no more explanations, just a decision sealed by silence. She walked away from the house that once shut her out, not with bitterness, but with dignity wrapped gently around her shoulders. The door behind her no longer held power. It was simply wood and hinges. The real home she carried now was within herself, a place where loyalty meant something, and respect was never optional. That Christmas ended differently than she had ever imagined, not with a crowded table, but with a small meal made just for two, herself and her son. They cooked together clumsily, laughing when the gravy turned out lumpy and the rolls browned a little too much. There were no polished speeches or perfect decorations, just honesty and warmth. They placed two candles on the table, one for truth, one for healing, and promised each other that future holidays would always make room for kindness first. It wasn't the Christmas she lost that mattered anymore. It was the one she gained, one built on respect instead of pretending everything was fine. Healing didn't happen overnight. Some mornings still carried the echo of old hurt, and some nights ended with silent tears. But slowly, the sharp edges softened. She spoke openly with her son, not to reopen wounds, but to understand how they had reached that painful doorstep. Together, they learned that ignoring small cruelties allows larger ones to grow. Therapy, prayer, quiet walks, each became a thread in the slow stitching of their hearts. She kept reminding herself that pain is not a life sentence. It is simply a valley that leads, eventually, to gentler ground. She began building a life that belonged to her again. She organized her finances, updated important documents, and learned to handle things she had once depended on others to do. Independence arrived like fresh air through an open window, a little cold at first, but invigorating. She discovered new routines: morning tea by the window, volunteer work twice a week, and evenings spent reading instead of worrying. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Simply choosing herself each day was enough, and that quiet choice became the strongest habit she'd ever formed. Old friends and a few new ones slowly gathered around her like a warm quilt. They invited her for dinners, church bazaars, movie nights, and long conversations over homemade soup. Not once did she feel like an obligation. She felt welcome. They never asked her to move on faster than her heart allowed. They simply walked beside her at whatever pace she could manage. Loyalty, she realized, isn't loud. It shows up consistently, remembers birthdays, checks in after doctor's appointments, and holds your hand when the world feels too heavy. Those friendships became the family she hadn't known she needed. When the next holiday season arrived, she decorated her home gently: a small tree, soft lights, and ornaments that carried stories rather than glitter. There was no rush, no expectation, no need to impress anyone. She hosted a simple dinner for a few close people, filling the room with laughter instead of tension. At the end of the evening, she washed the dishes slowly, grateful for the peace lingering in the air. Holidays, she learned, are not about full houses. They are about full hearts, and hers, finally, no longer felt empty. She carried herself differently now, not with pride, but with certainty. She spoke kindly, forgave carefully, and refused to shrink for anyone's comfort. Dignity became the steady rhythm of her days. She didn't revisit the past to reopen wounds, only to remind herself how far she had come. Even those who once underestimated her began to see the quiet strength she carried. Her worth was no longer a fragile thing. It was rooted, unshakable, bound not to approval, but to self-respect. One evening, she stepped outside and watched the sky fade into twilight, the world calm and unhurried. She thought of everything she had endured: the door slammed shut, the cruel words, the painful truths, and realized none of it had broken her. It had refined her. She walked back inside with gratitude for the years still ahead, no matter how many or few. From now on, she would choose peace over pretense, truth over silence, and love, always over bitterness. And with that promise to herself, she finally moved forward, without fear, without regret, and with her dignity shining quietly, like a lantern lighting the way.